In this video, we'll be taking a look at the 2024 electoral map if the polls underestimate Trump just like they did in 2020. Take a look at a state like Wisconsin. Joe Biden was supposed to win by 8.4%, but in the end, he only carried the state by a margin of 0.63. This means that the polls underestimated support for Trump by a whopping 7.8 percentage points. We would then apply this error to the 2024 polling and do that in all 50 states to create a map to show what the election will look like this November if the polls are just as wrong as they were 4 years ago. We'll begin on the West Coast, where the states of Washington and Oregon would be likely for Kamala Harris, while California will still remain a solid blue state. Moving down to Nevada, though, this is our first competitive state on the map, and we'll pay extra attention to these battleground states. So, starting off in the Silver State, we see that currently Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are in a complete tie when it comes to polling. Nevada is going to be a very competitive state. Democrats have won it in every election since 2008, but Trump has a real chance at flipping it in 2024. Look at the polling in 2020, though. The poll suggested a 5.3% victory for Joe Biden. Considering he only won Nevada by 2.4%, this means that the polls underestimated support for Trump by 2.9, which means that adjusting for the error, the former president is going to carry the Silver State this November by a margin of 2.9 percentage points, which is going to make Nevada a lean state on our map. Arizona, though, is going to be slightly more competitive. Looking at the polling from 2020, Biden was overestimated by a margin of 2.3 percentage points. He only won the state by a margin of 0.3. But the polling for 2024 gives Harris a very narrow 0.9% lead. And adjusting for the 2020 error, Trump is on track to come out with a victory of 1.4%. This would be Trump's second flip on this map already. And in terms of margins, anything over 15% is solid, anything from 7 to 15 is likely, anything from 2 to 7 is lean, and any margin less than 1% is going to be tilt. Next up, in Colorado and New Mexico, these two states both went to Biden by double-digit margins in 2020. That's unlikely to happen again, but Colorado will probably still remain in the likely blue column, while New Mexico is going to be slightly more competitive. The single poll that we have from the state between Harris and Trump shows the vice president leading by a 7-point margin. Polling in 2020 underestimated Trump by 0.9%, which means that in 2024, Harris is on track to carry the state of New Mexico by 6.1 points, which means that it will fall into that lean Democratic category. Down in Texas, though, the polling was pretty off 4 years ago. If you went off the polls, Trump was supposed to win the Lone Star State by just 1.1 percentage points. In fact, there were portions throughout the 2020 campaign when Joe Biden actually led in the polling in Texas. Now, the polls, just like they were in 2016, they always underestimated Donald Trump, and that's probably what's happening in 2024 as well. If you look at the final result in Texas, Trump won by 5.6 percentage points. It was a pretty easy victory for the former president, but the polling certainly didn't reflect that. And if you adjust this 4.5% error to Trump's existing 10-point lead this November, Trump is on track to win by 14.5 percentage points, just barely missing out on winning the state by a solid margin, but still a very, very strong victory nonetheless. Before we continue, only 11% of you guys are actually subscribed, so please take the time to subscribe right now for more content like this leading up to the election in November, and follow me on Twitter for daily political updates, link in the description below. We now have some solid states to fill in, states that really won't be that competitive. And so, beginning with the solid states for Trump, we have Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, North and South Dakota, nearly all of Nebraska, along with Kansas, Oklahoma, and finally Alaska. For Harris, though, she's going to carry the state of Hawaii by at least 15 points. While the 2nd District of Nebraska is going to be very competitive, Trump won it in 2016, narrowly lost it in 2020, and the 2020 census and redistricting in the 2nd District does make the region more favorable to Republicans, and so as of right now, it's going to be tilt in favor of the GOP. We're now going to move up to the Midwest, which is going to be arguably the most important region in this election. It's here where the election will be won or lost for both candidates. Kamala Harris has to win Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania if she wants to have any shot at getting 270 electoral votes. And so, starting off with the polling in Minnesota, in 2020, they were actually pretty accurate. The polls only underestimated Trump by a margin of 2.1%. Currently, Kamala Harris leads by 6 points in the average, which means that adjusting for this error, she's on track to carrying Tim Walz's home state by a 3.9 point margin. So the state of Minnesota is going to be lean Democratic. Harris is still the favorite, but Walz's impact probably is not going to be as strong as many people think. In Iowa, we don't actually have any polls between Harris and Trump yet, but I just want to show you how inaccurate the polls are in the Midwest. It's really in the Midwest where the polls over the last 8 years have been the least accurate in both 2016 and 2020. In 2016, there was really no doubt that Clinton was going to win Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. It was supposed to be a blowout landslide for the Secretary of State. However, in the end, Trump carried all three of these upper Midwestern states. He almost flipped Minnesota, and he won 306 electoral votes. In 2020, Joe Biden was supposed to easily win the election. He was supposed to easily win states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and also carry states like North Carolina and Florida. In the end, though, he very narrowly won Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and barely came out with a lean victory in the Wolverine state. So really, the polls in the Midwest have systematically been favoring Democrats over the last few election cycles, and that's really why you can't take them at face value. I mean, just look at Iowa in 2020. The poll suggested a 1.3% victory for the former president. In the end, he won the state by a whopping 8.2 percentage points. The polls underestimated support for Trump by nearly 7 points. That's almost the margin that Trump ended up winning by. And so in 2024, obviously, Iowa is going to be a solid state. But if he went off of just polling, the state of Iowa would probably seem a lot more competitive than it really is. Up in Wisconsin, we went over the state just a little bit earlier. The polls, of course, overestimated support for Joe Biden by 7.8 percentage points. I mean, that was just astronomically inaccurate from the pollsters because in the end, Joe Biden carried Wisconsin by 0.6%. In fact, Joe Biden did worse in Wisconsin than Trump did in 2016 when he won 4 years prior. Now, looking at the polling for 2024, Kamala Harris maintains a very narrow 3.2% lead. She may be ahead, but she is still doing worse than Biden in 2020 and Clinton in 2016 based on the polling alone. And so adjusting for that nearly 8-point error, Trump is on track to flip Wisconsin and carry the state by 4.6%. So the state of Wisconsin is going to be lean Republican on our map, while Illinois is going to be a likely blue state, and Indiana, of course, will be solid red. Moving up to Michigan, we have another state where Trump was massively underestimated in 2020. The polls suggested a 7.9 percentage point victory, and Biden led by this margin throughout nearly the entirety of the 2020 campaign. I mean, if you look at Wisconsin as well, it wasn't just at the very end. Biden was leading by this 7 to 8 point margin throughout the entirety of the 2020 race. And so in Michigan, a state that Joe Biden ended up winning by 2.8%, the polls overestimated Biden by 5.1 points. And so adjusting that error onto the 2020 polling, which shows Harris leading by a narrow 2.9% victory, Trump is on track to come out with a 2.2% victory in the Wolverine state this November. So Michigan will also be lean Republican. In Ohio, the polls were just as inaccurate as they were in Iowa. Trump was projected to win by just 0.8%. In fact, there were many polls that showed that Biden was on track to win. In fact, for most of the 2020 cycle, Biden was supposed to flip the Buckeye state after Trump carried it in 2016. However, in the end, Trump came out with an 8-point victory. This was basically identical to his 2016 victory when he defeated Hillary Clinton by 8.1 percentage points and flipped it from being a lean Obama state just 4 years prior. And so Trump has performed very well in the Midwest, but every time he is underestimated. And so when we adjust this nearly 8-point error onto the 2024 polling, Trump is on track to carrying the Buckeye state by 18.2 percentage points points, it's easily going to be solid for the GOP. While up in Pennsylvania, the polls here have been slightly more accurate in the last two election cycles. Democrats haven't been as overestimated as they were in both Wisconsin and Michigan. The polling only overestimated Biden by 3.5 points in 2020. And looking at Harris's 2.3% margin, this would mean that Trump is on track to winning by 1.2% in 2024. So Pennsylvania is going to be tilt Republican. It's going to be potentially the most important state of the election, and Trump does maintain a lead here if the polls are just as inaccurate as they were 4 years ago. Moving up to the Northeast now, most of these states are going to be either solid or likely for the vice president. So filling them in first, we have Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maryland, and the District of Columbia, along with the 1st District of Maine as being safe for Harris, while the states of New Jersey and Delaware are going to be slightly more competitive. Focusing in on New York now, the Empire State is going to be more competitive than it's been in any election since 1988. Democrats are in a really bad spot here ever since the resignation of Andrew Cuomo, along with the unpopularity of both Governor Kathy Hochul and Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City. So the polling in New York currently shows Kamala Harris to be on track to win by 11.5 percentage points. In 2020, though, the polls overestimated support for Biden by 6.3%. He was supposed to win by nearly 30 points, but only came out with a 23-point victory. And so adjusting for this error, Harris is going to win New York by just 5.2 percentage points, which will make it just a lean blue state. New Hampshire, though, would actually flip in favor of the former president. Polling currently shows Harris to lead by 3% on average for the 2024 race, while in 2020, the polls massively overestimated Joe Biden by 3.7 percentage points. The polls were okay for most of the election cycle. Joe Biden eventually came out with a 7.4% margin of victory, but those final polls from the Granite State really overestimated support for the incumbent president. And so adjusting for this error, Harris is actually on track to losing New Hampshire in 2024. Donald Trump is on track to win by a margin of 0.7% if the polls are just as wrong as they were 4 years ago. And this really isn't too surprising considering the fact that Trump almost won New Hampshire in 2016. Clinton carried the state by just 0.37%. It was the second most competitive state in the election, only behind Michigan. So Trump winning New Hampshire in 2024 is by no means a stretch. And finally, to finish off Northeast, up in Maine, current polling shows Harris up by 8 points. The polling in Maine was okay. It overestimated support for Biden by 4 points. And so adjusting for this error, Harris is going to win the state by 4 points. And so Maine will fall into that lean Republican category. And the 2nd District of Maine is, of course, going to be solid for Donald Trump. And to finish off the map in the Southeast, most of these states are going to be solid for the former president. Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia, Trump is going to easily win. Virginia, though, is going to be slightly more competitive. The polls here overestimated support for Biden by 1.7%, and considering that Harris only leads by 0.6% according to the polling, this means that Trump is on track to flipping Virginia by a 1.1% margin. This is definitely a state where Democrats are vulnerable, despite Biden carrying it by a double-digit margin 4 years ago. So Virginia is going to be the 4th tilt Republican state on our map. North Carolina is also going to be pretty competitive. The poll straight up pointed to an incorrect winner in 2020. Joe Biden was supposed to win the Tar Heel state by 1.8%. He was supposed to be the 2nd Democrat to win North Carolina in the 21st century after Barack Obama, who carried it by 0.3% in 2008. That was the only time up until this point where Democrats have won an election in North Carolina since 1976. And so the polls overestimated support for Biden by 3.1% in 2020, as in the end, Trump came out with a 1.3% margin of victory. And so adjusting for this error onto the 2024 polling, Trump already leads by 0.5%, but with this adjustment, he's on track to holding onto North Carolina by a 3.6% margin of victory, which will make the Tar Heel state lean Republican. Polls in Georgia have actually been pretty accurate over the last few election cycles in both Senate, governor, and and presidential elections. It's one of the few states where Trump isn't really underestimated as much as he is in many other regions in the Midwest and the Sun Belt. But looking at the polling for 2024, Harris leads by a very narrow 0.2% margin. That really isn't enough for her to win, though. Polling in 2020 underestimated support for Trump by 1%, and so Trump is going to win Georgia by 0.8. It is seriously very unlikely that Harris can actually flip the peach state. Georgia definitely favors Trump. It went to him by 5 points in 2016, and he lost it by the narrowest of margins in 2020 under very negative circumstances for the Republican Party as a whole. And so to finish off the map in Florida, this is another state where the polls simply got the result wrong 4 years ago. Joe Biden was supposed to win Florida. In fact, he led throughout every single moment of the 2020 campaign. Florida was supposed to go to the now incumbent president by 2.5 percentage points. But in the end, Donald Trump came out with a victory by an even larger margin, winning Florida by 3.4%. Trump was underestimated by 5.9 points 4 years ago. And over the last 4 years, of course, Florida has taken a considerable shift to the right, with both one of its senators and its governor reelected by solid 16 and 19-point victories in 2022. And so adjusting for the error onto Trump's existing 6-point lead in the Sunshine State already for the 2024 matchup, Trump is going to win Florida by 11.9 percentage points, making it a very clear victory for the former president by a likely margin. Florida is no longer a battleground state. You're not going to find too much polling from it anymore, even though in the past it was one of the most polled and one of the most important states in the entire country. And so if the polls are just as wrong as they were 4 years ago, Donald Trump is on track to win 330 electoral votes, flipping Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, the 2nd District of Maine, Virginia, and Georgia. This would be the worst Democratic performance since the Michael Dukakis in 1988, and it would be a modern-day landslide victory for the former president. And the point isn't that he's absolutely going to win 330 electoral votes, but it's to show that even though Harris might have improved in the polling, she still has a very long way to go, as she is still doing much worse than Clinton in 2016 and Biden in 2020 when it comes to the polling. And in 2016, of course, Clinton lost, and in 2020, Joe Biden barely won the election. It was only 3 states that he carried by less than 1% that got him over 270. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe right now for more content like this leading up to the election in November, and join my Discord server, link in the description below.